With my experience and your ambitions, let's navigate the world of business, making informed choices and capitalizing on every opportunity. Welcome to Profit or Pitfall. From financial analysis to the LOI to the PTR to PCRs, we're continuing our journey through commercial real estate diligence. And today I'm going to unravel the pivotal Phase 1 environmental site assessment process. This is different from the PCR because this is not about the building, but about the ground underneath. And at its core, a Phase 1 determines the environmental integrity of a property. And over the years, the methods have evolved, but its essence really remains the same. There's a public record review, there's on-site reconnaissance, there's interviews with individuals, previous owners, potential owners, just looking at any way you can get story on the property, and then the report itself. So I want to walk you through a quick sample Phase 1 report so you can kind of see what it looks like. Now, normally, if you look up here, long report, okay? And I redacted a portion of it because it belongs to a deal that I'm working on right now. But what is important is for you to understand kind of what it is you're going to receive. And so, one is you're going to get the executive summary. This is the property we looked at, and here's some assumptions that we made. Here's some limitations about what we could or couldn't do. We're relying on certain people. So like we talked about those interviews, for example, they're talking to the tenants, that kind of thing. They're doing visual inspections, reconnaissance, and then understanding kind of, what the user, which is normally the bank and the owner, what their responsibilities are when they're using this report. And so you'll see here, there's, current historical addresses, legal descriptions, the physical setting. And if, like I told you, if you haven't seen the previous 4 episodes about diligence on commercial real estate, I encourage you to watch them. Because this physical, like current and historical addresses and legal descriptions, you don't want to be wrong on this, right? And so in fact, this transaction I'm working on is 4 different parcel numbers, and one had an address, but it's a postal address, not a title address. And so we had to make sure that we removed that postal address because of how the bank, or the lender, was going to vest and put those things in their loan documents. Very important to be as accurate as possible. And then, like I said, here's the site reconnaissance, right? Observations, exterior, interior, where they were limited, looking at surrounding property uses. Now, this particular place, there's housing behind it, then there's retail in front of it. Some properties may be all surrounded by industrial properties. So is there a guy, building something with chemicals across the way that might be leaching onto his property? Lots of things to think about, right? Interviews, right? Property owner, the manager, the occupants, the potential buyer, neighboring properties, what do you know? What have you seen here? Oh, there used to be a gas station here. If you didn't know that because it's a parking lot right now, doing those interviews is where you'll find out. Looking at liens, looking at the property valuation. Maybe you have old appraisals, those always help to kind of understand more about the property. Historical land use. So you can find all kinds of aerial photography, topographic, building department records. And that's kind of where sometimes there can be a hiccup or a bottleneck where, you ask for information and it's just not readily available because there's this one person who has to go get it for you. And then understanding where the data gaps are, understanding, if you're looking at regulatory databases, where are there other problems going on? And then, here's words that you probably have seen, right? Asbestos, radon, mold, methane gas. So all these things kind of come together to help you understand what's going on with the property. And what you're trying to avoid is you're buying yourself a lawsuit, right? Or a problem that requires tons of money to clean up. And an acronym you will hear when talking about Phase 1s is CERCLA, CERCLA, which is an acronym for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. You will probably know this as what's called Superfund, which was enacted in the early 80s. And the primary goal is to address the cleanup of hazardous waste sites and to hold responsible parties accountable for the cleanup costs. And one critical aspect of CERCLA is that particularly relevant to real estate transaction is the liability provisions, right? Because they're trying to figure out, okay, who's gonna pay for this if they know that somebody was dumping, some type of chemical or oil or whatever. And so there's what's called strict liability. You may have heard that from your attorney. Strict liability is what the basis that CERCLA uses. And that means basically is that parties can be held responsible regardless of when they were at fault for the contamination. So this could be pretty significant, potentially involving the cost of cleaning up the contamination, damages for injury or loss of natural resources, and even health assessment costs with the region. So you could have the county after you, you could have individuals after you because they've been hurt. You could be damaging the water supply or discover that the water supply has been damaged. And so you have what are called PRPs, which are potentially responsible parties. And that can be the current owner or the operators of the facility. So you could be the property owner, but maybe you've got a factory as your tenant. Past owners or operators at the time of disposal. And then there's the generators and the parties that arrange for the disposal or transport of hazardous substances. And then, of course, the transporters of the hazardous waste to a selected disposal site. So a lot of people involved. I have friends who are engineers, and that's all they buy because they know how to clean these types of properties up, and they get it ready for a developer who wants to build housing or a fast food joint. And the phase one really helps protect both the buyer and the lender and the seller from such unforeseen liabilities. I've had the opportunity to recommend people to do the phase one, and I've also had to read through these reports. They're anywhere from 400 to 600 pages. And what you're looking for is to see if there are any recognized environmental conditions or RECs. And these are flags that can range from current concerns. So maybe if there's a auto body shop or a guy who fixes cars, mechanic, that's being kind of sloppy with how they have their barrels of oil, whatever, to controlled conditions. Maybe there's something that's already been fixed in the past, historical, things that we know about the past. And then there's de minimis, right? And so guess who writes all those details? Now, if you watched my last episode, we talked about ASTM. Basically, the guys who write all the standards for everything, they're here too. So they're the ones kind of giving the guidelines about, okay, here's what de minimis looks like, here's what historical looks like, here's what controlled looks like. Now, you have your phase one, and so when you're reading through your report, sometimes the RECs hint at deeper issues. There's the soil, it's the groundwater, or there are vapors, and this uncertainty is when the phase two steps in. So think of phase one as the detective and phase two as the scientist. So one identifies risk, the other quantifies them. And usually in the phase two, you have someone going on site and boring these small holes on the property and taking soil samples back to the lab and understand how bad the situation is. And here's a transaction that I'm working on right now, where you'll see that this actually had a phase two on it. And if you look here, you see B16, B17, B21. These are all sites or holes that have been bored on the property. And so I'll give you kind of an example of how these can come into play. Is this property has this, basically my client owns all this right here, and we're getting ready to demolish this to build low-income housing. And the issue at hand is that this property is pretty old, and what used to be here was a gas station. So there used to be tanks here. Right now there's still a repair shop, mechanic shop here, and then there's another mechanic shop over here. So there's still that type of, what you would call dirty type of work going on, necessary but dirty. And so this is where you can see where they've bored quite a few holes, and there were some elevated conditions in terms of what's being released into the air. So this property is going to have some remediation taken care of before they can actually put sticks in the ground for the low-income housing. So I'll stop there. Let me kind of move on and go back to what I was discussing. So phase one, they won't break the bank, but you can expect variability in cost. And if you remember the PCR, we talked about kind of a cost per square foot. It's just kind of the same thing. You look at factors like the property size, its history, and their intended use. That kind of plays the part. And then typically it can be anywhere from a 2 week to 4 weeks to 6 month week journey. But hurdles can arise, like getting responses from the county or the city government when they request records on the property that might not be publicly available or online. Not everything has been scanned just yet. So sometimes, depending on the city you're dealing with, if it's a smaller city, maybe they don't have the resources to get everything scanned. So somebody has to go physically pull a file still. Now, if the phase one is straightforward, I would say phase two is the complicated cousin, right? This is where costs can spike, like I showed you in the picture there. And it might stretch your transaction timelines, because if you're using a lender or you have investors standing behind you, this is not a place to look penny wise and pound foolish. You don't want to try yourself, buying a lawsuit, walking into a lawsuit. And so this is where you kind of learn to make the call. Do you stay or do you walk away? Because, RECs, or recognized environmental conditions, can be daunting, especially when you ponder remediation cost and the property's future role. And so as an investor or developer, it's a balancing act between risk and reward. And over the years, I've witnessed both, or actually all kinds. I've seen deals that have thrived post phase two. Like this deal is going to be pretty amazing once it gets done. Maybe a couple of years, but it's going to really impact the neighborhood because that area really does need it. And I've been in deals where the deal got killed in the middle of everyone wanting to get across the finish line because everybody wanted to do the transaction. But the lending source was just like, sorry guys, like unless this stuff gets done before we close, we're not going to do it, And so that becomes an issue of understanding how to find money that's out there at the state level, county level, the federal level. And there's just properties that are just better left untouched unless you are someone, like I mentioned, who's an engineer, has a background on this, and really knows what it takes to get something like that cleaned up. So it's important to understand what kind of monies are out there for remediation. I have access to dollars at the state and local level that you just have to know how to get through relationships and knowing how to fill out the paperwork to make the state or the county's job easier, because their goal is to clean up property. And believe me when I say that phase ones are not just a formality. If you talk to any consulting firm that does this for a living, they'll talk to you about the difficulties they run into in their state and how some other states have figured out an easier way to get these reports done. And there can really encourage investment in the region for places that have just been a very long time where there's dirty properties, and because it's just so hard to get them cleaned up, they remain that way. And so there's no opportunity to build housing or to clean up the water in that region. So the important thing to remember here is that I've been talking about over the last few episodes is that commercial real estate is beautifully complex. There's an intricate web of legal, environmental, financial landscapes to cover, and a property that looks perfect on the outside can hide secrets beneath the surface that can turn your dream into a nightmare unexpectedly. So be diligent, build those relationships, and make informed decisions so you can make a profit and don't fall into a pitfall. Okay, I'll see you next week when we cover a deal I'm working on right now in the healthcare space. I think you'll enjoy it. A little more mathematical in the headspace in terms of how we're using a number of different capital sources to get the deal done. I'll see you next week. Take care.